Okay, so I screwed up a bit at the end of that last stream. I intended to transition to another Twitch, another obscene in my broadcasting software where I would talk about my closing thoughts on the game. And while I did that, and you saw the same title card on it, there was no audio. So, and I didn't find that out until after I had listened to it and realized I had 4 minutes of like dead air. So, if any of you, I know there are three of you who are watching the stream, are wondering what the hell was going on. Sorry about that. I'm gonna try and cover this again, and probably won't be exactly the same, but just my closing thoughts on Phantasy Star 3 after spending I think 2.5 months or so playing it. Uh, it's if you've watched what I've been playing and listened to my comments and how I kind of complain about the game a lot and stuff, you may kind of get the impression that well, Phantasy Star 3 doesn't seem like a very good game. And it's not really. And I need to qualify how I say that because certainly there are people in who love Phantasy Star for whom Phantasy Star 3 is their favorite game. I have met those people, they exist, and I am not trying to crap on your favorite game by any means. And I should say that Phantasy Star 3 is absolutely not without merit. I do not find it an enjoyable game to play, but it is an interesting game to talk about. Maybe the most interesting game of the series to talk about because of what it tries to do. The ambition and scope of the game is really amazing, and I would love to see a similar concept revisited in some other series out there. But the basic idea that you start out in what appears to be a fantasy world and a fantasy society, and as you play through the game, come to realize that your planet isn't a planet at all, but is actually a giant spaceship journeying through space, and over thousands of years, the inhabitants of the spaceship have forgotten that it's not an it's been done before certainly in science fiction, but as far as video games go and a lot of other types of media, that is a crazy cool idea, and I can only imagine how cool that would be if they tried to do it with like a modern AAA sort of game. Like what a head spinner, right? So I have to respect its ambition, even if it kind of falls, I think, well short of what it was trying to do. And if you're really interested in that, and I hesitate to recommend, don't consider this a recommendation. It's more just for an awareness. But there is an upcoming mobile game in the Phantasy Star series called Phantasy Star Saga Idola or something like that. It hits on September 17th, and it does appear to be cribbing from Phantasy Star 3 extensively, possibly as far as setting goes. Because at this time, when I saw it, and I'm not really a big mobile game player at all, let me tell you, but it appears to be just a straight up fantasy game, which is weird, right? Because Phantasy Star is all about that kind of crazy blend between fantasy and sci-fi. Like, yes, there's swords and there's kind of stuff like magic, but also people fly around in spaceships and there are robots and all this other stuff. It mixing in with the fantasy elements, and to have a game under the Phantasy Star franchise that just seems to be a completely original fantasy setting with almost no connection to the rest of what's expected for the rest of the series just seems weird. And so, they talk about Dark Forest that comes up, and I expect that they are going to do a similar thing in that game. I expect it's taking quite a bit of inspiration from Phantasy Star 3, so I may check it out just on that basis. The other thing I want to talk about is the generation system, which was a big selling point of this game when it was originally released. That was the big draw of it, saying, hey, use the generation system to determine what direction the plot goes in, to determine who you want to marry, and determine what kind of stats your next protagonist has. That was a major draw of this game. It was, I would say, the central feature around which the game was based, and it is flawed, but it is one of the earliest known mechanics, I think, for merit for doing what you do in this game, for the idea of marrying, your love interest, of having children, of passing on abilities based on your choice of who you marry to your next protagonist. I would not be surprised if this was actually the first game where that kind of thing has been implemented, and I strongly suspect that it influenced the design of a much more successful and better game, in my opinion, that came out 2 years later, which was called Dragon Quest V. And if you're not familiar with that game, Dragon Quest is a great series, by the way. If you love JRPGs, definitely try to check it out. You can consult any number of lists or internet searches on where the best jumping on point would be. But with Dragon Quest V, you follow the protagonist of that game from childhood to young adulthood to being a full adult. And you see them, not only do you see them grow, you can also choose at a certain point of the game who you want to marry. And unlike in Phantasy Star 3, your choice of marriage doesn't turn the game into different routes per se. The story is always the same, but it does impact, you know, there's dialogue. There's some different dialogue based on who your wife is, and your wife is a party member as well. But it also affects your children. I don't know if it affects their stats, but their appearance is definitely affected by it. And I just it's given the time frame, given how development of games worked back then, I think it's totally possible that Yuji Horii, the creator and continuing franchise head of Dragon Quest, possibly saw Phantasy Star 3, maybe even played it and said, "Huh, this is a really interesting idea. Maybe I should try something like that in my next Dragon Quest game." And now, and Dragon Quest V was a deeply influential RPG in the first place. It's one of the best ranked Dragon Quest RPGs over in Japan. The movie, the recent Dragon Quest movie that came out, Your Story, is a version of the story from Five, which should tell you something about how loved that game is over there. And so the influence of that can be felt very powerfully. There are so many Japanese games now where you can choose who to marry, where you can have children, and even some Western games where that's a factor as well. Fable's the one that comes top of mind there, and it's harder to draw a connection there. But I absolutely think that uh, that if that those games owe a debt to Phantasy Star 3. Even I think it has a important place in history as the kind of prototype of that idea. You know, and because this was kind of a prototype and it was a first try, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't go well. Obviously, the battle system is it's extremely serviceable. There's nothing exciting about it. I had to play with the text speed at max actually in order for the battles to go as fast as they did. What you didn't see when I wasn't streaming it is that I was playing with like text speed at like 3 or 4, and the battles were painfully slow. I had to constantly spam button presses to try and get through things. And it wasn't until I found that out later from talking to some people online that I realized that if I increased the message speed, I would increase the rate at which battles complete. So, because of the amount of resources I think they had to invest in creating those different generation paths, the characterization of the game is really just lacking. There's not a whole lot of dialogue in general or talk or crosstalk between party members. There's very little difference between the protagonists, really, and this shows up most clearly in the third generation, where yeah, your protagonist looks different, but the story is basically the exact same. There's almost no difference in dialogue or anything outside of the way that the individual routes start and the way that they end. And that's after you get past the initial ending screen of how they escape from the shoot and all that. But of all the Phantasy Star games, all the classic Phantasy Star games, I think this one is the most deserving and would potentially benefit the most from a remake of some sort. Not that I really ever expect Sega to do anything like that, because I think they're pretty content to kind of leave this classic franchise where it is and just continue to develop the Phantasy Star Online franchise, which is, of course, their right. But I think it is a shame in some regards that they don't kind of pick the original Phantasy Star series back up in some way, shape, or form. I wouldn't necessarily even want a continuation to the original series, because as we're going to see with Phantasy Star 4, which is coming up as my next streamed game, it the series does get brought to a pretty, I think, satisfying conclusion, which is very impressive for 1995, when kind of in hindsight, video games were just taking off back then. And of course, we've seen many other RPG series with which Phantasy Star was a contemporary, like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, continue to be successful in this day and age. But I think that closes up all my thoughts on Phantasy Star 3. So, like I said, I'll be playing Phantasy Star 4 next. I'm not sure when. Well, it'll probably be in about 2 weeks or something like that because I've got a vacation coming up next week. My fiance and I have a lot of plans to do, and I feel like if I start playing Phantasy Star 4 this week, I totally could, but I'm going to want to keep playing it and keep streaming it, and it's really hard for me to kind of play a game in a position when I can't stream it because I don't want there to be gaps in the streaming coverage. But so it might be best to just start it when all that stuff is quieted down. But for those of you who watched all the videos, especially if you were in the audience while I was streaming, I know there were a lot of you who didn't have Twitch accounts, but I saw you in the user chat. So thank you. I appreciate you kind of tuning in and following me along this journey, even if it was silently. No problem at all. So by all means, I hope you continue to watch. And I'm looking forward to starting Phantasy Star 4, which is my favorite of this series, and a game I never actually finished. So I'll be talking a lot about that too as I continue to play through it. But for now, I think I've let this run long enough. So without further ado, this is Retro Nights. I am Desmancer, and I'll catch you next time.